Hey everyone. Okay, so thanks for joining me for the recording today. We're going to go through something new. This is not really a lot of what we've talked about so far. We've talked a lot about what we can observe as far as the behavior is concerned. And then from what we observe, whether it be the contingency or the antecedent, right? So the A or the C of the ABC. So we've been doing a lot of that, where we've talked a lot about observations and things that we can do there to help determine what the function of the behavior is. So this next step that we're talking about today, which is acceptance and commitment therapy, is going to be going more into what we would call the inner behavior. So B.F. Skinner was a radical behaviorist, and so it's important that we very much keep that at the forefront of what we do. Otherwise, we will solely focus on what's observed only. That's redundant, but we'll only focus on what's observed. And then we neglect a lot of what's happening on the inside. And what we find is that usually what happens is that the first person that we neglect to observe as far as the inner behavior is ourselves, right? And then that also, when we neglect observing our own inner behavior, prevents us from tending to the needs of the learner's inner behavior. This doesn't dismiss the function of the behavior. It simply adds to what is necessary to talk about when we're talking about the function of behavior. So I'm going to go ahead and we're going to pull up this first article that we're reading here. And this one is actually about the caregivers. And this one's really, really, really important whenever we're talking about what we're going to be doing as far as behavior change programming and buy-in for caregivers. So let's break this one down just a little bit. This is ACT-based interventions for reducing psychological distress in parents and caregivers of children with ASD, and then recommendations for higher education programs. That's us, right? So this is a recommendation for us. This is a calling to be for us to really think about these things whenever we're talking about behavior change. Now, this is the European Journal of Behavior Analysis. So again, like, this isn't going to be something that you're going to find in JABA, but it is something that our colleagues in the EU have already been talking about and researching for over 6 years. So when we talk about this, it goes through like the history of what it looks like to have a child who is on the spectrum. And then it also talks about what the hope for this article was. So the primary aim of this paper, provide a brief overview of the literature. Cool, we already know that. That's pretty much what you're always going to see whenever it's an article like this. How ACT can be beneficial for caregivers right away, and then what we can do for our trainers to help implement this, and then discuss, of course, the future possibilities of what this looks like. So it is not new information that caregivers of those whose children are autistic or somewhere on the neurodivergent spectrum, within the neurodivergent spectrum or umbrella, face a great deal of stress. So it's been self-reported. It's also observed in their overt behaviors. So they might express what it is that they're experiencing, which is overwhelm. They might actually be, when they're talking to behavior analysts, there's a lot of intimidation. And so they might essentially engage in lying behavior, right? Because they don't want you to know how bad it really is. And that's actually pretty common in clinical practice. So there are things that we can do. There's actually quite a bit of research to support how ACT can be beneficial for caregivers. That's what all of this research has gone through. It's actually talked about it for decades worth of research. So what we're going to talk about right now is essentially what is ACT in general. Acceptance and commitment therapy is 6 core processes of psychological flexibility. And this right here is a visual representation of what psychological flexibility looks like. We call this the hexaflex or the matrix. So when we're stuck here in the center, those are those intrusive thoughts, those intrusive behaviors, those avoidant behaviors that we engage in. And when I say we, I mean anyone. So caregivers, learners, ourselves, right? Anyone that we encounter on a day-to-day basis, we all have these thoughts and these feelings, and we all engage in behaviors that might not be helpful. We call this cognitive fusion. The way that we can get out of cognitive fusion is usually by engaging in one of these 6 core processes. This does require some inner behavior. It also requires usually a verbal report, and then also moving into what more overt behaviors such as committed actions can be doing. And so if you look here in parentheses, we have what the opposite of the 6 core processes. So the opposite of committed action is inaction, avoidance, right? Impulsivity. Instead of, this is something that is in line with my values and a behavior that's going to support what I'm doing. Sometimes that can be really difficult, though, for people who struggle with who they are and maybe struggle with introspection, self-reflection. This would be that self as context piece. You'll also find, too, that this is where people struggle to take the perspective of another person. This is really important when we're talking about ACT, especially with caregivers, because we need to be able to sit down put aside our own perspective for a moment so that we can listen to what the caregiver's true perspective is before we make any suggestions about what their committed action should be. That's also why I would suggest that we would have to do some sort of values assessment. Then what we often find is this cognitive diffusion is that kind of silliness, the thing that keeps us separated from the cognitive fusion. So when we're really stuck with something, this is where we can find that little bit of peace to be able to move forward and accept what we can't change. These are all things that are really difficult to do, in all honesty. But when we practice all 6 of these things together, it really helps. And then when we think about present moment, we often ruminate on what's going to happen in the future, especially caregivers, as well as what has happened in the past. So what this moment is trying to do is really help us teach our caregivers how to truly engage in what would be considered the present moment. So that's connecting the brain, the mind, to what's currently happening in the current environment. So I encourage you to read this article if you haven't already, simply because it does actually give you quite a bit of tools to go through whenever you're about to make this next step. This way, when we talk about like caregiver buy-in, instead of worrying about the buy-in, we're working with them. And then the reason I say I would really read through these support groups, these tables right here, because they're incredibly informational. So if there's anything in this article that you would read, definitely start on page 11 to just kind of see some of these strategies that they used. And then you'll see that you can go all the way through page 15, and those 4 pages have quite a bit of information on them for you. Okay, cool. Now we're going to talk about the next step. How do we assess for some of these things? So the PBAT is how we assess. Let me get this screen up for you. So our process-based assessment this is very much in the School of Psychology. So I'm not going to suggest that we do this at all with somebody else. This is something that we need to do for ourselves first. So this is essentially talking about the evidence-based processes that can be done through the assessment process to help us determine what we would call process-based assessment. So process-based is something that we've kind of talked about a little bit. And the reason I say that is because we've talked about what it looks like when we talk about those shifts in behaviors, right? Those precursors. We talked about that last week when we were talking about the PFA. We were also talking about it when we were talking about doing a precursor assessment. So what we're talking about now is slightly different because we're going to be relying a little bit more on verbal behavior and then comparing what happens between the verbal report versus what's observed. And so it adds that little bit of robustness to what we would talk about with assessing for inner behavior. And you'll see too, this is a great paper. It has actually been fully published by this time, but when I first had access to it, it was just in the Word document. So I'm going to quickly go through this one because, let's see, there we go. You will have to still set up these types of conditions, just as we would have with any of our functional analyses that we've been discussing throughout the semester. So this is essentially where we start, what behavior is typically happening, and then what would be the other behavior, the adaptive behavior, right? The skill that we're trying to teach instead. So we're actually going to go through that together. Well, y'all are actually going to do that. You're not going to send me these assessment results. However, you are going to say what you found from these assessment results. Does that make sense? So I'm going to skip to the, when you go to the iPass, I'm going to skip to that real quick just so that you can see. Pull it up for us. It's in your assignments. Uh-oh. Oh, no, I didn't do that one. Okay, that's fine. So, oh, good. So I didn't have that as a requirement. Instead, we decided to do this. Sorry, y'all. When I was writing my syllabus earlier, I had a couple of different ideas about how we would do this class, but I'm glad that we did this instead. Okay, so I really want you to think about that whenever we're talking about this next step here, which is now going to be something that is very much behavior analytic in our nature. I know the first two articles that we talked about were more in the field of psychology. It's still important that we do that because applied behavior analysis is in the field of psychology. Now, this article recently came out in 2023 by Dr. Teresa Camille Colo. Most of us just call her Camille or Dr. Colo. But she's done quite a bit of research on what trauma does to behavior and how it affects behavior. So one of the things that we talked about was how to provide buffers to solve these barriers. So barriers would be what we were talking about earlier, those avoidant behaviors, that impulsivity or just lack of values-driven behavior change. You'll notice that a lot of times when you're working with caregivers and you give them an intervention, they're truly incapable of implementing that intervention. They might actually be incapable of meeting some of their everyday needs, which is then going to prevent them from any sort of long-term behavior change. So what Dr. Colo has found within the medical community was that there has been quite a lot of research on trauma and behavior, and there are 6 buffers that we can present and create and set up our caregivers for success that can essentially help prevent or mitigate the risks of adversity or ongoing trauma. So we talked about the first buffer is nurturing relationships. Second one is nutrition. Third is physical activity. Fourth is healthy sleep. 5 is mental health care. And 6 is the ability to engage in mindfulness or actively reducing stress. This is why we talked about ACT first, because ACT helps address both mental health care as well as mindfulness and reducing stress. So again, this is all about caregivers today. And when we were talking about ACT, when we present some of those strategies, we are creating this buffer and this buffer here. When we're doing that, we're essentially laying this foundation of, I don't want you to do anything else for your child, such as teaching them demand or to reinforce commands every time, because they're not going to be able to without having taken care of these 6 things. So what Dr. Colo then did is try to figure out how can we assess for the caregivers whenever this is happening, and how can we present it to them. I love this flow chart right here because y'all are in grad school. It's really difficult to talk to caregivers about some of these things. So what she suggests is that we start here. We're going to talk about these 6 areas. I don't want to answer that. Assent withdrawal, right? We know what that is. Oh, all right, cool. I'm just going to leave these little bit of resources with you. Or if she's like, sure, yeah, let's go ahead. Great, then we're going to go here. But at any time, there's I don't want to do that. That's assent withdrawal. We leave it at that, okay? It might take a year before you're able to fully have this conversation. And I say that with experience because sometimes there are some of our caregivers that I work with currently where it takes us about a year to get through some of these questions, and that's okay. One buffer at a time. So this article is fantastic, y'all. I also love this article because it helps us also assess our own behavior. Okay, so Dr. Kolu loves a good acronym. This one is called Butterflies. This is an assessment that's actually really designed to help determine what buffers are currently in place and which ones aren't. This is a great place for you to score yourself as well as to start this whole process. In my clinical opinion, there is no way you're going to be able to assess another person's behavior if you have not assessed your own behavior first and accounted for your own behavior. This is one of the ways to do that, and this is one of the places to start. The second place would be going into ACT, and we'll talk about that some more next week. Okay, so the IPASS is this really pretty cool assessment. It's called the Inventory of Potentially Aversive Stimuli and Setting Events. This goes in addition to the one that we were just looking at within Dr. Kolu's article. This is also by Dr. Kolu. This one also has been out a little bit longer than the first one, the butterflies that she just presented to us. These are all things that you can assess for yourself as well as then assess with the caregivers. What you'll end up getting is an inventory, a score of then what to do. So here's what I'm going to ask of you. I'd like for you to do this yourselves. This is one of your assignments, is to complete this IPASS. So this is, again, I'm giving you a completion grade on this one. I don't need to know what is in this data because this is your information. It's private information. However, I do need to know that you have some sort of understanding of this. So what I'm going to ask of you is that after you complete this, then I would like for you to email me one thing that you learned from this assessment process about yourself, and 2, what buffer you're going to address for yourself. It could be more than one buffer, but give me at least one buffer that you're going to be addressing for yourself. Okay, so that is your class for today. It's pretty heavy intensive with reading, but that's okay. Y'all can do it. You're really amazing at this. And then you're going to complete this IPASS assessment. You're going to let me know what buffer you're going to address and one thing that you've learned. That's your assignment. Okay, everyone, thank you so much. Email me if you've got any questions, and I'm happy to help. And we will continue to go through the rest of our assessments through next week. Thanks so much.